Margaret was a woman with a gentle heart, known in her small town for always helping others. She lived a simple life, but her kindness made her rich in ways money could never measure. From the outside, people thought she had everything: a cozy home, a steady job, and a peaceful routine. But behind her warm smile was a silent pain. Years ago, Margaret had faced the heartbreaking truth that she could never have children of her own. For a long time, this emptiness weighed heavily on her heart. She longed for the joy of holding a child in her arms, of hearing laughter echoing through her home, of having someone to share her love with. One evening, while volunteering at a local orphanage, she met a quiet little boy named Daniel. He was only 5 years old, with eyes that carried a sadness far older than his years. Daniel rarely spoke and often sat alone, clutching a small toy car with chipped paint. The caretakers explained that Daniel had been abandoned as a baby and moved from one foster home to another, never staying long enough to feel safe. Something inside Margaret stirred when she looked at him, an unspoken bond, as if fate had placed him in her path. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began spending more time at the orphanage. She would read stories to the children, bring them little treats, and sit beside Daniel, hoping to break through his silence. Slowly, Daniel began to respond. First, it was a shy smile when she offered him a cookie. Then it was the way he leaned closer when she read his favorite story. And one day, he surprised everyone by whispering a single word: "Mama." Margaret's heart nearly burst with emotion. It was in that moment she knew she could not let this boy grow up without love. The process of adoption wasn't easy. Margaret had to prove she could provide for Daniel, filling out endless forms, going through interviews, and waiting for approval. Many nights she lay awake, worrying if she was doing the right thing. Could she give him everything he needed? Would he learn to trust her as his mother? But her doubts always melted away whenever she saw his eyes light up at her visits. She promised herself that no matter what it took, she would give this child the love he deserved. When the day finally came, Margaret signed the papers with trembling hands. The caretakers hugged her and whispered, "He's lucky to have you." But Margaret thought the opposite. She was the lucky one. Bringing Daniel home was like filling an empty space in her heart she had carried for years. The house that once felt too quiet now echoed with the footsteps of a little boy. She decorated his room with bright colors, bought him new clothes, and prepared his favorite meals. Daniel, who once sat silently in corners, now began to laugh, play, and explore. Margaret gave Daniel more than just a roof and meals. She gave him a mother's love. She walked him to school every morning, cheering him on when he made friends or did well in class. At night, she tucked him into bed with bedtime stories, kissing his forehead and reminding him that he was loved. Slowly, the sadness that once clouded Daniel's face began to fade, replaced with the glow of a child who finally felt safe. But raising Daniel was not without sacrifice. Margaret worked long hours to ensure he never lacked anything. She gave up buying new clothes for herself, cut down on outings, and skipped luxuries so she could save for his future. Every coin she saved went toward Daniel's education, toys, books, and anything that could give him a better life. People around her admired her strength, but very few knew how many nights she went to bed exhausted, worrying if she was doing enough. Despite the struggles, Margaret never complained. Every time she looked at Daniel, she saw a reason to keep going. He was her son, not by blood but by love, and she cherished every moment they shared. She proudly attended his school plays, clapped the loudest at his sports events, and always stood by him whenever he stumbled. To the world, Daniel was an adopted child, but to Margaret he was her miracle, the answer to a prayer she thought would never come true. This act of kindness, choosing to love and raise a child who was not her own flesh and blood, changed both of their lives forever. For Margaret, it was a chance to heal her broken heart and fulfill her dream of motherhood. For Daniel, it was the gift of a family, a safe place, and a love that asked for nothing in return. What no one knew then was how this bond, so pure and full of sacrifice, would one day be tested in ways Margaret could never imagine. Margaret's life changed completely after Daniel came into her home. From the moment she signed the adoption papers, she stopped thinking about herself and started living only for him. Every choice she made, every step she took was for Daniel's happiness and future. People around her often said she spoiled him, but Margaret didn't see it that way. She believed he had suffered enough in his early years without parents, and now it was her duty to give him everything he had been denied. At first, life wasn't easy. Daniel came with wounds that no one could see. He often woke up at night crying from nightmares, clinging to Margaret as if he was afraid she might disappear. He sometimes refused to eat, pushing away food and muttering that he didn't deserve it. Those moments broke Margaret's heart, but she never lost patience. She would sit beside him, stroke his hair, and whisper, "You are safe now. I will never leave you." Slowly, her gentle words healed the cracks in his little heart. Margaret worked tirelessly to keep her promise. She had a modest job as a clerk in a local office, and the salary was just enough to cover the basics. But basics weren't enough for her son. She wanted him to have opportunities she never had. So she took on extra shifts, cleaned houses on weekends, and even sold homemade pies to neighbors. She cut down her own expenses to the bare minimum. While other women her age bought new dresses or treated themselves to small luxuries, Margaret wore the same old coats and shoes for years. Her only joy was watching Daniel smile when she brought him a new school bag, a pair of sneakers, or a set of crayons. There were times when money was painfully tight. The electricity bill would arrive, the rent would be due, and Margaret would sit at the kitchen table late into the night, calculating every penny on a scrap of paper. Many nights she went to bed hungry after making sure Daniel had enough to eat. But she never once let him know her struggles. To Daniel, life seemed comfortable. He saw his mother as strong and capable, never realizing the silent sacrifices she made behind closed doors. As Daniel grew, his needs grew too. Margaret saved every coin she could for his education. She believed knowledge was the greatest gift she could give him. Even when he was just in elementary school, she set aside money in a small jar labeled college fund. It wasn't much, but she told herself every drop of water eventually fills the pot. When relatives questioned her, "Why save so much for him? You're not even his real mother," Margaret would smile softly and reply, "Love doesn't ask for reasons. He is my son, and I will give him the world." Daniel, of course, didn't understand her sacrifices. As a child, he simply accepted the toys, the books, and the delicious meals she prepared. When he wanted a bicycle, Margaret worked late nights for weeks until she could afford one. On his birthday, she saved for months just to buy him the latest toy robot. She lived for his joy. Every giggle, every hug, every "thank you, Mama" made her hardships worth it. Years rolled by and Daniel turned into a teenager. Like many boys his age, he began craving independence, and sometimes he rebelled against Margaret's rules. He wanted branded clothes, expensive gadgets, and outings with friends that cost more than Margaret could afford. Still, she tried her best to provide. She would walk to work instead of taking the bus just to save money for his wishes. When he accused her of being too strict or too old-fashioned, she never argued back. Instead, she reminded herself that teenagers speak in anger, but don't mean half of what they say. Her sacrifices weren't just financial. Margaret gave up her own dreams too. She once loved traveling and hoped to see the world, but she never left town after adopting Daniel. Vacations, parties, hobbies, everything was put aside. Her time belonged to him. Even when she was exhausted, she cooked his favorite meals and waited up at night until he came home safely. She ignored her own health issues because doctor visits were expensive, and she couldn't bear the thought of spending money on herself, while Daniel's needs were endless. To outsiders, Margaret appeared strong and content. Neighbors admired her dedication, often saying, "That woman would walk through fire for her son." They weren't wrong. Her love was fierce, unconditional, and selfless. Yet in her quiet moments, Margaret sometimes felt the weight of loneliness. Friends of her age were enjoying peaceful retirements or spending time with grandchildren, while she was still struggling with bills and a restless teenager. But whenever doubt crept into her heart, she only had to look at Daniel's face to feel reassured. She told herself she had chosen this life and she would see it through no matter what. Deep down, Margaret also carried a secret hope. She dreamed that one day, when Daniel grew into a man, he would look back and realize the depth of her sacrifices. She hoped he would embrace her, not just as the woman who raised him, but as his true mother, worthy of respect and gratitude. This dream gave her strength on the hardest days, when her body ached from work or when her heart sank at his careless words. What she didn't know was that life doesn't always reward kindness the way we imagine. Sometimes the very people we sacrifice everything for can become blind to our love. And though Margaret gave Daniel her blood, sweat, and tears, his heart was beginning to change in ways she never expected. Daniel's childhood had been full of warmth, because Margaret gave him everything she could. But as he entered his late teens and stepped into adulthood, something inside him began to change. The innocent boy who once clung to Margaret's hand now started to drift away from her. At first it was small things, rolling his eyes when she gave him advice, shutting his bedroom door to keep her out, or ignoring her when she asked him simple questions about his day. Margaret thought it was just a phase, the natural stubbornness of youth, and that he would grow out of it. But slowly those small cracks widened into something much larger. Daniel had always been bright. Margaret worked day and night to give him a good education, and he was clever enough to use those opportunities to his advantage. At school he was popular, admired for his sharp mind and charming personality, but with success came arrogance. Compliments from teachers, applause at competitions, and admiration from friends fed his ego. He began to see himself as smarter than everyone, even smarter than the woman who raised him. Margaret's gentle reminders, "Stay humble, my son, or don't forget where you came from," fell on deaf ears. He laughed them off, believing she was old-fashioned and didn't understand the modern world. As Daniel entered university, the distance between him and Margaret grew even wider. He no longer came home for family dinners, often staying out late with friends. His new circle of companions was very different from Margaret's modest world. They wore branded clothes, drove expensive cars, and flaunted a lifestyle that dazzled him. To keep up with them, Daniel demanded more money. "Everyone has the latest phone, Mom. Do you want me to look poor?" he would say, without thinking about the pain in Margaret's eyes. She never told him how many nights she skipped meals or worked extra hours just to meet his demands. To Daniel, money seemed to appear as easily as air. Slowly, his values shifted. Where Margaret saw life as a blessing and people as treasures, Daniel saw status, wealth, and material possessions as the only things that mattered. He began to resent his mother's simplicity, her old clothes, her quiet habits, the way she counted coins before paying bills. "Why can't you be more like other parents?" he once snapped. "They know how to live. You're just stuck in your little world." Those words cut through Margaret like a knife, but she said nothing. She still believed deep down that her son's heart was good, that one day he would understand her sacrifices. But the changes in Daniel were not just about money. His attitude toward Margaret herself grew colder. He no longer introduced her proudly as his mother. Sometimes, when his friends asked about her, he simply said, "She's the woman who raised me," avoiding the word mother altogether. Margaret noticed, but she pretended not to. She told herself he was just embarrassed, that young people often struggle to balance pride with gratitude. Still, each time he denied her, a piece of her heart broke. When Daniel graduated, he secured a well-paying job. For Margaret, it was a moment of pride. She imagined him finally standing tall, independent, and ready to build a bright future. She hoped he would take her hand and say, "Mama, all your hard work wasn't in vain." But instead, success only fueled his arrogance. With money in his own pocket, he began treating Margaret like a burden. "You wouldn't understand my work," he would say whenever she asked about his job. He stopped listening to her advice altogether, brushing her off with, "That's not how the world works anymore." Soon, Daniel's home, the very house Margaret had filled with love, began to feel like it belonged to him alone. He redecorated it without asking her opinion, filled it with things she neither liked nor understood, and began inviting his friends over while ignoring her presence. When she tried to remind him of family traditions like their Sunday dinners, he told her he was too busy. "You should stop clinging to old habits, Mom," he said. "I'm not a little boy anymore." Margaret tried to reach him in countless ways. She cooked his favorite meals, asked about his life with genuine interest, and reminded him gently about the values she once taught him. But each attempt seemed to push him further away. He saw her kindness as weakness, her sacrifices as obligations, and her love as something he no longer needed. The more she gave, the more he took her for granted. And then came the turning point. Daniel, blinded by his growing pride, started to see Margaret not as his mother but as an obstacle. He wanted freedom. Freedom from her advice, her old ways, her presence in his home. To his friends, she was just the old woman who raised him. To himself, she became a shadow of his past, something he wanted to erase so he could shine brighter in his own future. What Daniel didn't realize was how deeply his transformation wounded Margaret. Every harsh word, every cold look, every rejection tore at the very soul of the woman who had once given up everything for him. Yet she remained silent, carrying her pain in her heart, She had given him life not through birth but through love and sacrifice, but now that very love was being trampled under the weight of his arrogance. The boy who once whispered "Mama" in fear of being abandoned had now grown into a man who was abandoning the very woman who saved him. And this transformation, unnoticed by Daniel, was only the beginning of a tragedy that neither of them could have imagined. The day that Margaret had always feared, yet never believed could truly happen, finally arrived. For years she had noticed the distance growing between her and Daniel, but she clung to the hope that love would eventually bring him back. She told herself that all children go through phases of rebellion, that someday he would remember her sacrifices and embrace her again as his mother. But Daniel's heart had hardened in ways she could not imagine. One chilly evening after another long day at work, Margaret returned home with a bag of groceries. Her hands ached, her back was sore, but she smiled as she thought of making Daniel's favorite stew for dinner. She pushed open the door only to find Daniel waiting in the living room, his expression cold and serious. Something in his eyes made her pause. This wasn't the boy she had raised. This was a stranger. "Mom," he began, though his voice carried no warmth. "We need to talk." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She set the grocery bag down on the table and sat across from him, nervous but attentive. She braced herself for news about work, or maybe a problem with his friends. Instead, Daniel dropped words so sharp they felt like blades. "You can't stay here anymore. This house belongs to me now. I need my space, my freedom. You've done your part, but it's time for you to move out." For a moment, Margaret thought she had misheard. She blinked, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. "What do you mean, Daniel? This is our home. I raised you here. Where would I go?" Daniel leaned back, arms crossed, his tone firm and detached. "That's not my problem. You've had your life. Now I need to live mine. I can't keep looking after you. You're holding me back." Margaret's breath caught in her chest. Never in her darkest dreams had she imagined her son, the boy she had rescued from loneliness, the boy she had fed, clothed, and loved, would cast her aside like an unwanted guest. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I gave you everything I had, Daniel. Every sacrifice, every dream I let go of, it was all for you." But Daniel looked away, unmoved. "And I didn't ask for that," he snapped. "I'm grateful, sure, but I don't owe you my entire life. You're not even my real mother. You adopted me, remember? Don't make me feel guilty for wanting to live on my own terms." Those words struck harder than any physical blow. Not my real mother. For Margaret, it was as if her very soul had been crushed under his careless sentence. She had never thought of him as anything less than her own flesh and blood. She had given him her heart without conditions, yet he now used her love as a weapon against her. The days that followed were unbearable. Daniel began packing her things into boxes, piling them near the door without her consent. He treated her presence as if it were an inconvenience, urging her to leave quickly. Neighbors who had admired Margaret's devotion whispered in shock as they watched her walk past with bags and belongings. Some offered sympathy, but Margaret, too proud to admit her heartbreak, only nodded with a weak smile. Inside, she was breaking. Each corner of the house held memories. Daniel's laughter as a child, his first steps across the living room, the nights she had stayed awake nursing him through fevers. And now all of it meant nothing to him. He saw her not as a mother, but as a burden standing in the way of his selfish ambitions. One night, when Margaret pleaded with him to reconsider, Daniel's patience snapped. "I don't want to argue, Mom. Just leave. Go wherever you want, but don't stay here. I can't live my life with you watching over me like some old shadow. It's over." Those final words silenced her. With trembling hands, Margaret picked up her worn suitcase, the same one she had used decades ago when she first brought Daniel home from the orphanage. Only this time it was not filled with hope, it was heavy with despair. She walked out of the house that she had built with love, leaving behind not just bricks and walls but a lifetime of memories. The night was cold, the street eerily quiet. Margaret's heart felt like it was being torn apart piece by piece. She had always believed that a mother's love was unshakable, that it could withstand anything. But now she stood alone, betrayed by the very child she had dedicated her life to. As she found a small bench at the end of the street and sat down, tears streamed freely down her face. She whispered into the darkness, "What did I do wrong? Was my love not enough?" Yet even in her pain, she didn't curse him. She didn't hate him. Deep inside, despite his cruelty, she still loved Daniel. That was the tragedy of a mother's heart. It never stops beating for her child even when he breaks it. What Daniel never realized in that moment was that he was casting away far more than just his mother. He was turning his back on the very foundation of his life, the love and sacrifice that had made him who he was. And he was blind, completely blind to the truth Margaret carried within her. A secret that would soon change everything. For hidden behind her silence, Margaret had something Daniel never dreamed of, a fortune worth $9.5 million. But instead of revealing it, she carried her pain quietly into the night, determined to let fate decide how the story would unfold. Margaret walked away from the house with a heavy heart, carrying only a small suitcase and the weight of her son's betrayal. To the world, she looked like an old, broken woman abandoned by her only child. Neighbors whispered, some in pity, others in judgment, but no one knew the full truth of Margaret's life. For behind her frail figure and modest ways, she carried a secret so astonishing that it could change everything. Throughout her years of sacrifice, Margaret had not only worked to provide for Daniel but had also been quietly saving and investing. While Daniel believed she was just a poor, ordinary woman who barely managed bills, Margaret was far wiser than he ever gave her credit for. She had learned from a young age that money, if handled carefully, could grow into something powerful. Long before adopting Daniel, she had inherited a small piece of land from her late parents. At the time, the land was almost worthless, just an empty stretch on the outskirts of town. But Margaret held on to it, believing that someday its value might rise. Years later, that same land was bought by a development company, and Margaret received a large sum, more than she had ever imagined. Most people would have spent it on comfort, but Margaret was not like most people. She placed the money into safe investments, shares in companies, savings accounts, and bonds. She lived modestly, never revealing her growing fortune to anyone, not even Daniel. Every penny she earned, every penny she saved, became part of a carefully built nest egg. By the time Daniel forced her out of the house, Margaret's hidden wealth had grown to an unbelievable $9.5 million. Yet she never flaunted it. She still wore simple clothes, still cooked humble meals, still walked instead of taking a cab when she could. To Daniel, she seemed like a woman scraping by, while in reality she was wealthier than most people in their town. But why did Margaret hide it? The answer lay in her heart. She didn't want Daniel to grow up spoiled or arrogant. She wanted him to understand the value of hard work, the dignity of modest living, and the importance of gratitude. She believed that if he knew about the fortune, it would change him, make him greedy, entitled, and careless. Sadly, even without knowing, Daniel still grew into those very flaws. As Margaret sat in a small rented room after being cast out, she reflected on the irony of her life. She had sacrificed everything to give Daniel comfort, never once using her wealth for herself. And yet, he had treated her as though she had nothing to offer. She looked around at the bare walls of her new living space and whispered to herself, if only he knew. But Margaret was not ready to reveal her secret. Instead, she kept it hidden, locked away in accounts and legal documents that bore her name. She knew the truth would eventually surface, but she wanted it to come at the right time. Not as a weapon of revenge, but as a lesson. She believed that fate would teach Daniel what she no longer could. Meanwhile, Daniel carried on with his life, blissfully unaware. He strutted around with pride, telling his friends how he had finally claimed his independence and gotten rid of the woman who held him back. He lived in the same house Margaret had turned into a home, now filling it with parties, luxury items, and a lifestyle built on arrogance. To him, Margaret was just a shadow of the past. He never imagined that the woman he expelled was silently carrying a fortune larger than he could dream of. There was a certain justice in Margaret's silence. She thought of all the years she had worked, all the pennies she had saved, all the sacrifices she had made. If Daniel had treated her with kindness, if he had shown her even a fraction of the love she had given him, the entire fortune would have been his. She had always intended to leave it to him, believing that it would secure his future and reward him for being her son. But now, after his betrayal, her heart had changed. She began to think differently about her wealth. Maybe it was not meant for Daniel after all. Maybe it was meant for something greater, for children who truly needed help, for families who valued love over money, for charities that could change lives. The thought brought her peace. For the first time in years, Margaret realized that her sacrifices had given her more than just pain. They had also given her the power to choose who truly deserved her blessings. Late at night, she would write in her journal, documenting every detail of her life, her savings and her decisions. This wealth, she wrote, is not a gift of luck. It is built from sweat, tears, and years of patience. It must never fall into ungrateful hands. And so Margaret guarded her secret. She lived quietly, blending into the world as just another aging woman making ends meet. But beneath that humble exterior lay the strength of a lioness and the fortune of a queen. What Daniel never realized was that by pushing his mother out, he had pushed away the greatest gift life could have given him. His arrogance blinded him to the truth, and that blindness would soon come back to haunt him. Because secrets have a way of revealing themselves. And Margaret's hidden $9.5 million was a secret too powerful to stay buried forever. Time has a way of revealing truths no one expects. For weeks after forcing Margaret out, Daniel lived as if nothing had happened. He celebrated his freedom with loud laughter, flashy purchases, and late-night parties. To him, he had finally broken free from the old-fashioned woman who always nagged him with lessons about humility and gratitude. His friends praised him for being bold and living life on his own terms. But what he didn't know was that life was preparing to teach him a lesson he could never forget. Margaret, meanwhile, lived quietly in her small rented room. She avoided the places where people might gossip about her, and spent her days in peace, away from the chaos of Daniel's world. Though her heart ached, she found comfort in silence. She prayed for her son, not for revenge, but for his awakening. She still loved him even though he had broken her spirit. But love, she realized, didn't mean blindness anymore. She would not allow her fortune to fall into the hands of a man who threw her away like she was nothing. The revelation came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Daniel received a letter addressed to Margaret. The postman, not knowing she had moved out, had delivered it to the old house. Curious, Daniel tore it open without a second thought. Inside was a formal notice from an investment company. His eyes widened as he read words that didn't make sense at first. Account balance $95,12,643.26. At first, Daniel thought it was a mistake. He laughed, shaking his head. How could his mother, his simple penny-pinching mother who wore old sweaters and cooked plain meals, possibly have millions of dollars? She could barely afford the electricity bill, or so he thought. Yet the papers were clear, stamped with official seals and signed by legal officers. His hands began to tremble. He read the numbers again and again, his heart racing. He dropped the letter on the table, pacing back and forth. Memories flooded his mind. The times he mocked her for saving pennies. The times he accused her of being poor. The way he pushed her out of the house like she was nothing. Shame began to burn inside him. How is this possible? He muttered. But deep down he knew. His mother had always been careful, always wise with money. He remembered the jars she kept on the shelf, the notebooks filled with neat handwriting where she tracked every coin. He had laughed at her then, but now he understood. She hadn't been poor. She had been preparing. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt small. His arrogance crumbled as he realized the truth. The woman he had abandoned was far richer, wiser, and stronger than he ever imagined. And worst of all, she had trusted him with her life and he had betrayed her. Panic set in. What if she had already given the money away? What if she left it to someone else? He picked up the letter again, scanning every line for answers. There was a note about a scheduled meeting with Margaret's financial advisor. The date was only a few days away. His stomach knotted. He knew he had to act fast. That evening, Daniel sat alone in the big house, surrounded by all the things he once thought mattered. Expensive furniture, gadgets, branded clothes. Yet none of it brought him joy anymore. All he could see was his mother's face, lined with years of sacrifice, and the way her eyes had filled with tears when he told her to leave. The guilt was unbearable. For the first time since childhood, Daniel cried. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing at the realization of what he had done. He had thrown away the only person who truly loved him, and in doing so, he had also thrown away his future. The following morning, Daniel rushed to find Margaret. He searched through old neighbors, asked at the orphanage where she once volunteered, and visited places she used to go. People shook their heads, some saying they hadn't seen her in weeks. The more he searched, the more desperate he became. It was as if she had vanished, leaving him with nothing but regret. At last, he found her sitting quietly in a park, feeding pigeons with a gentle smile. Her clothes were plain, her face calm, but her presence radiated the same warmth it always had. For a moment, Daniel froze. He wanted to run to her, to fall on his knees and beg for forgiveness, but shame held him back. When Margaret finally noticed him, she didn't react with anger or bitterness. She simply looked at him with tired, knowing eyes. "Daniel," she said softly, "what brings you here?" His voice cracked as he replied, "Mom, I didn't know. I didn't know you had all that money. I thought you were poor. I thought you were holding me back." Margaret's eyes filled with sadness but not surprise. "Money doesn't define love, Daniel. I never told you because I wanted you to grow with values, not greed. But it seems I failed. You pushed me out because you thought I had nothing. Now you see the truth and it's too late." Daniel's heart shattered. He fell to his knees in front of her, clutching her hands. "Please, Mom, forgive me. I was wrong. I was blind. I don't want the money, I just want you back. Please come home." But Margaret, though her heart softened at the sight of her broken son, knew she could not return to the life she once had. His betrayal had cut too deep. Her silence, her hidden fortune, and his sudden desperation all confirmed one truth. The lesson had to be learned. She gently pulled her hands away and said, "Home is not about walls and roofs, Daniel. Home is where love lives. You chose to throw me out. Now you must live with that choice." And with those words, she stood and walked away, leaving Daniel in tears, surrounded by the ghosts of his mistakes. The shocking revelation of her hidden $9.5 million was not just about money. It was about the priceless value of love, gratitude, and respect. And Daniel, for the first time, realized that wealth without love was emptiness in disguise. Daniel sat alone in the big house, once so full of noise and laughter, now echoing with silence. The revelation about his mother's hidden fortune haunted him day and night. He could not sleep without hearing her voice, calm yet firm, telling him that love, not money, was the true meaning of home. Every corner of the house reminded him of her: the chair where she used to sit knitting, the kitchen where she cooked his favorite meals, the walls that had once been filled with warmth. But now everything felt empty. His friends, who once admired his independence, began to drift away. At first they enjoyed his parties, his flashy spending, and the freedom of his mother's absence. But when the money he earned was not enough to keep up with their expensive tastes, they found excuses to leave. Invitations stopped coming, calls went unanswered, and soon Daniel realized he was alone. The same friends who had praised him for pushing his mother out now laughed behind his back, calling him arrogant and foolish. At work, Daniel's pride also began to cost him dearly. He had always been ambitious, but his arrogance made him careless. He clashed with his bosses, ignored advice, and thought he knew better than everyone else. Slowly, his reputation turned sour. Projects slipped out of his hands, promotions went to others, and whispers spread through the office. Within a year, Daniel, once seen as a rising star, was quietly pushed out. Bills began to pile up. The big house that once seemed like a palace became a burden. Without his mother's steady hand to manage things, Daniel found himself drowning in expenses. Repairs, taxes, and utilities ate away at his savings. He sold his car, then his gadgets, and finally pieces of furniture just to survive. The same neighbors who had once admired his confidence now watched him with pity, shaking their heads. Some even whispered, "He threw out the woman who gave him everything. This is his punishment." But the greatest punishment was not financial, it was emotional. Daniel missed his mother more than anything. Every time he saw an elderly woman on the street, he hoped it was her. Every time he passed the park where she once sat feeding pigeons, he searched for her familiar figure. But Margaret stayed away. She had chosen peace over pain, and Daniel was left to live with the consequences of his betrayal. One evening, as he sat in the empty house, Daniel found himself staring at the letter again, the one that revealed her hidden fortune. His eyes blurred with tears as he realized the full weight of his mistake. If he had shown her love, if he had respected her even a little, everything she had built would have been his. Not just the money, but her trust, her blessings, and her pride. Instead, he was left with nothing but guilt. Karma had returned, not as a dramatic punishment, but as a slow unraveling of everything he once valued. He had gained freedom, but lost the only person who truly cared for him. He had gained wealth and material things, but lost the greater wealth of love. And now, The $9.5 million that could have secured his future was gone forever out of his reach. Meanwhile, Margaret used her fortune wisely. She donated to orphanages, built shelters for children, and supported families who struggled like she once did. Her name became associated with kindness, generosity, and compassion. People praised her as a woman who gave back to the world despite her own suffering. She found peace in knowing that her sacrifices were not wasted. They were simply redirected to those who deserved them. News of her charitable work eventually reached Daniel. He read in the local paper about the orphanage that had been renovated in her name, the scholarships she had established for poor children, and the shelters that now carried her legacy. Each word was like salt in his wounds. That fortune could have been his. But more importantly, the pride of being her son could have been his too. Instead, he had become the man who threw away the most precious gift life had given him. As the years passed, Daniel's loneliness deepened. He tried to rebuild his life, but the guilt never left him. Every smile from a child reminded him of the mother who had once smiled at him with unconditional love. Every act of kindness he witnessed reminded him of the kindness he had rejected. Karma did not strike him with sudden tragedy, it lingered, a shadow that followed him everywhere, reminding him of what he had lost. One night, sitting alone in the dim light of his nearly empty house, Daniel whispered into the silence, "I had everything, and I threw it all away." Tears rolled down his face as he realized the harsh truth. Karma wasn't just about punishment, it was about reflection. Life had given him a mirror, and in that mirror he saw the man he had become. A man who betrayed the one person who loved him most. The once proud son was now a broken man, stripped of friends, fortune, and peace. All that remained was regret, and though he longed for his mother's forgiveness, he knew some mistakes could never be undone. Years passed, and the distance between Margaret and Daniel became permanent. Time, which heals many wounds, did not erase the scars of betrayal. Margaret chose not to return to the house that once held her memories, nor did she ever confront Daniel again. Instead, she poured her remaining years into helping others. She found peace not in riches, but in giving those riches away to people who truly valued love, gratitude, and kindness. Her name began to spread across the town and beyond. Newspapers wrote stories about her generosity. Orphanages that once struggled were now thriving. Children who had no shoes now walked proudly to school with books in their hands because of her scholarships. Families who had lost everything in poverty were given homes through her donations. To the world, she became a symbol of compassion. To those who knew her past, she was proof that even a broken heart could still create beauty. But for Daniel, the years brought only silence and regret. The big house that once felt like a symbol of freedom turned into a prison of loneliness. Dust gathered on the furniture. The rooms echoed with emptiness, and not a single visitor crossed the threshold. The laughter of friends had long since disappeared, and the pride that once filled his chest had turned into a heavy stone of shame. Sometimes, he would take out old photographs. He saw a smiling boy holding hands with a woman who looked at him with pure love. He saw birthday cakes she had baked, toys she had gifted, moments she had captured with pride, and every picture reminded him of what he had lost, not just a mother, but the love that no amount of wealth or success could replace. Daniel often thought about the day he discovered her fortune. At first it had filled him with shock, then it brought guilt, but now it carried a lesson. He realized that the $9.5 million had never been the real treasure. The real treasure had been her, the woman who gave him a life, a home, and unconditional love when he had nothing. Money could come and go, but love like hers came only once in a lifetime. Karma had returned to Daniel in the most painful way. He was alive, but he lived with emptiness. He was free, but chained by regret. He had everything a man could desire once, but he lost the only thing that truly mattered. That was his punishment, not the loss of wealth, but the loss of peace. Meanwhile, Margaret's legacy grew stronger. She passed away quietly in her sleep one morning, her heart finally at rest. The news spread quickly. The woman who had once been cast out by her son had left behind a legacy that would last for generations. The town mourned her deeply. Hundreds attended her funeral, orphans, families she had helped, children whose futures she had secured. They spoke of her kindness, her humility, and her endless sacrifices. Daniel, upon hearing of her death, rushed to the service. For the first time in years, he stood among people who praised her, their words cutting through his heart like knives. He stayed at the back, ashamed to step forward, afraid to admit who he was. When someone whispered, "That's her son, the one who threw her out," Daniel lowered his head in silence. The weight of his choices pressed heavier than ever. At the graveside, he finally collapsed to his knees. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry. I see it now, I see everything. You were my wealth, my home, my everything, and I threw it all away." But his apology echoed into the wind, unheard by the woman who had once longed for his love. And yet, perhaps in some unseen way, Margaret forgave him, for a mother's love, even when betrayed, never truly dies. It lingers in the lessons, in the memories, in the silent hope that one day the child will understand. Daniel walked away from her grave that day, not with money or inheritance, but with the heaviest lesson of his life. He realized that respect and gratitude are worth more than any fortune. That betrayal may give temporary freedom, but it steals peace forever, and that love, once broken, can never be replaced. From then on, Daniel lived differently. He no longer chased wealth or pride. Instead, he spent his days quietly volunteering, donating what little he had and helping children in need. Perhaps it was his way of honoring his mother's memory, or perhaps it was his attempt at redemption. But no matter how much good he tried to do, the emptiness of losing her remained. The story of Margaret and Daniel became a lesson told in whispers around town. Parents reminded their children, "Respect your mother and father. Love them while they are here. Do not wait until it's too late." And children, hearing the tale, hugged their parents tighter, understanding the value of gratitude. The final lesson of Margaret's life was simple but powerful. Wealth is meaningless without love. Sacrifices are priceless, and respect is the greatest gift a child can give to a parent. Betrayal may win freedom, but it always invites regret. And so, the story ended not with the fortune of $9.5 million, but with something far greater. The reminder that the richest inheritance a parent can leave behind is love, and the greatest loss a child can suffer is the loss of that love through their own choices.